Welcome back, my ghouls, to Haunted Saskatchewan, where we dive into the paranormal activity and history of locations around southern Saskatchewan, hopefully one day to be Saskatchewan and beyond. So today at this location, we actually toured it in the morning, but the funny thing is, even though we toured it in the morning, we still caught something unexpected in the video, and so stick around till the end and you'll get to see it. I'm curious to see what you think it was. So if you're new here and you're interested in paranormal activity in Saskatchewan, as well as some of the history behind Saskatchewan, then make sure you stick around. In today's video, I'm going to take you through a little bit of the history of the location first, and then I will let you know about the paranormal activity, as well as who we think the ghost might be. And at this location, they affectionately have named their ghost Howie. Welcome, my ghouls, to the government house in Regina. Okay, so let's head back to a big year in Saskatchewan. So if you've watched my previous videos, you know that in 1882, it was a pretty big year for Saskatchewan. And that's because the Canadian Pacific Railway decided to build the railway across southern Saskatchewan going towards the west. So back before 1882, when it was announced that this railway was coming to Saskatchewan to connect, coast to coast, it was decided that the presence of the Queen's representative, which was the lieutenant governor, needed to be moved closer to the railway. At the time, this whole area was known as the Northwest Territories, and the lieutenant governor up until that point was based out of the Battlefords. So when the railway was going to come through, it was decided that it had to be moved to a location that was already decided as one of the settlements along the railway, which was, of course, what we know now as Regina. So they picked a location that was about 4 kilometers west of the city limits of Regina at the time. Of course, nowadays, the government house is well within Regina city limits because it is spread so large. But that back then, it was just an open field. And so they wanted to make sure that it was royal looking and had a real authority to the area and stood out. So they decided to do an English estate style. This meant that they had a lot of the modern conveniences of the time, be it ice house, a windmill with a well. There was even vast vegetable gardens to make sure that they had lots of food to eat in the wintertime. Even the telephone system that was new to Regina was wired out so that the government house could have their own telephone. So by 1891, the house was finished, and the lieutenant governor and his staff was able to move in. Now, as time went on, of course, new things came out. So in order to stay modern and with the times, they actually did some renovations in the early 1900s to add things like a greenhouse, redo the heating system, add electricity. They even hooked up to the city water, so they made sure that Regina was supplying water to the building. Unfortunately for Saskatchewan and many parts of the world, the 1940s proved to be a little bit more difficult for the economy. So it was decided that having a lieutenant governor in this big, beautiful royal house with all of these conveniences maybe was sending the wrong message. So all of the furniture was sold off, and the lieutenant governor and his staff moved out. Then it was given to the Department of the Veteran Affairs. They actually turned it into a convalescent home for veterans that were coming back from the war and didn't have anywhere to go or anyone to take care of them. So all of the walls were painted white and cots were put into places so that people could sleep. So just imagine that, like being in the ballroom, there was all these lines of cots and the walls were all painted white, but they left the chandeliers in place. So they were all sleeping under these beautiful chandeliers in the ballroom together. It'd be a little bit different. Of course, Regina wanted to make sure that the veterans were a big part of the community, so lots of events happened at the government house, then known as the convalescent home. But it was short lived. They ended up building a new convalescent home for the veterans, and it was in Wascana, where I believe it is still located now. And this was in about 1958. So in 1958, it changed hands. And instead, it was the Department of Education that took over and decided to make an adult education building. So they filled the room full of tables and chairs and desks, and that was where you could go and take classes if you were an adult and you wanted to learn something new. So now, instead of cots lined up in the ballroom, it was actually desks, or tables and chairs at least. Now, this only lasted for about 20 years, because by 1978, the Saskatchewan house was finished and they closed down. Now, over the years, the building had started to get run down. It wasn't being taken care of as good as it was when it was the lieutenant governors, of course, because, funding is different. So, luckily, a group that is now known as the Government House Historical Society actually spoke up for the house. And they made sure that the house got historical site label by 1971. So, when the Saskatchewan house was no more, they were able to start fundraising to bring back the old glory of the government house. And it was decided to turn it into a museum that replicated kind of the area of the 1890s, I think it was, to 1910s. So, of course, since all of the furniture had been sold off, except for some china that had accidentally been locked into a safe, they had to go out and buy antiques. Which, when you're talking paranormal activity, it's a little bit difficult to tell where a ghost comes from when you're in a building full of antiques. So that makes it a little bit harder to decide really who the ghost is. But we'll get to that in a minute. So by 1980, the government house opened as a museum. And actually, more recently in the 1990s, the lieutenant governor returned to start using part of the house for their events and things. But a portion of the building is still the museum, and you can visit it today. So that is where I did my tour. I went through the museum and kind of got to hear some of the ghost stories and some of the experiences from the staff. And funny enough, the staff has actually embraced the hauntings. They are okay with the ghosts. As I said, they've named one of them Howie because they feel that he was a past worker from the government house back in the 1930s. So Howie, or Chun Li was his actual name, is the only known person to have passed away actually in the building. So back in 1938, while he was a cook for the lieutenant governor at that time, he had actually passed away from pneumonia. Now, Chun Li was an interesting character. They say he walked around the house in slippers and that he didn't like children. And one day on Halloween night, when children were trying to trick or treat, supposedly he poured dirty dishwater on the kids. So I guess it wouldn't be surprising if he wants to play tricks in the afterlife. Now, given the large number of antiques in the building, it's hard to really say who the ghosts are and if it's actually Chun Li. But we do know that they seem to like helping out the staff or playing tricks or just trying to get attention. So some of the actual paranormal activity. Let's first talk about the library. So in the library, there is this big replica painting of the Queen. So what had happened was during a tour, one of the guys was talking about the painting and why it was created when some of the guests weren't paying attention. And so when they asked again, like who's in the painting, they had these pamphlets about the Queen up on a shelf nearby. And the pamphlets had actually fallen over and fallen onto the ground at the feet of the guests. So I don't know, someone trying to say, hey, pay attention, or maybe just trying to help. Hard to say. Then when you move into the Great Hall, there's actually a chair that's sitting underneath the clock. And the interesting thing about that clock is it's actually from the original government house as well. But anyway, back to the chair. The commissionaire, which actually the commissionaires seem to be the ones that get the most activity. Guests don't tend to see it. Even some of the main staff that come during the day don't see it. But the commissionaires seem to capture a lot of it themselves because they tend to be alone in the building. So anyway, the commissioner had come in and the chair was sitting in the middle of the hall. So they went looking around the building trying to see who was in the government house already. Not being able to find anyone, came back to push the chair back into place against the wall. And here the chair had turned around, but there was no one in the building. So it seems we have a ghost that likes to, change furniture or maybe give their style tips. I don't know, because there's another instance in the hall where there's a ceremonial sword on this big table. And on the wooden table, they had placed this lacy tablecloth. And they kept finding when they came in the morning, the tablecloth would be on the ground. So they put it back up. And then a few days later, the tablecloth was on the ground again. So finally, they just moved the tablecloth to a different table, and they left the table without a tablecloth. And so since then, the tablecloth, even though it's still in the hall, just on a different table, it hasn't been pushed off of its current table ever since. Now, the last occurrence that we have on the main floor is in the billiard building. So the billiard building was where the men went, to have a cigar, to talk about politics or whatever it is they wanted to talk about when the women weren't around, or to play games. And so they have a pool table in the billiard room, and it has two pool cues and some pool balls placed around the table. They have it set up so that you can see them when you go in and tour the building. Now, what had happened was the commissionaire was working, heard a commotion downstairs, went down to see what was going on. And here, when they walked into the billiard room, the balls had been moved and the pool cues were on the floor. So apparently someone had decided they wanted to play pool that night, I guess. Now, when you go upstairs, it's mostly some old bedrooms with some old furniture, a couple of bathrooms. But one thing that's interesting that the commissionaires have had experience with has to do more with the day nursery. So, one of the stories goes that at night you could sometimes hear babies crying, but they thought maybe a cat had got in, or the mewing of a cat maybe. So they had searched the house high and low trying to find this cat, couldn't find it, and eventually the crying baby stopped. There's also a music box sitting in the day nursery. And apparently that music box has been known to just start playing music randomly when it wants to, and they don't know why it starts. So now, as I mentioned, we actually ended up catching something that we can't explain on the video. So to give you context, I was upstairs with the tour guide and the guard of the museum. There was only the three of us upstairs, and then my husband, who was acting as my cameraman that day, was downstairs, and he decided to do a couple sweeps with the video camera just to make sure he had them before coming upstairs. Now, as he was coming up the stairs, this happened. One of our visitor experience hosts who are they're our part-time tour guide interpretation staff, they told me that whenever they walk up the stairs, some people wink at her. Oh. Whenever they walk up the stairs, some people wink at her. Oh. I'm not sure why. Sometimes I'm like, yeah, I'll give her a wink. The knock came from behind my husband, and on my digital recorder that I had at the top of the stairs, where I was standing with the only other two people that were in the building with us, did not catch the knock. So I don't know, was Howie trying to get a close up or trying to say, hey, you're talking about me, I want to be in the video too? I don't know. What do you think it was? Now, I highly recommend that you check out the government house, not only for the paranormal activity and ghost stories, which, by the way, you can check out for yourself. You can go on around Halloween, they actually have ghost tours at night where you can go in at night to the government house and do a tour with the tour guides, and they tell you all about the ghost stories and the paranormal activity. I highly recommend it. I've actually been on the tour, and I'm thinking of going again. But they do sell out early, so make sure you book it fast if you see it. But they also have other things that are not related to paranormal. They have Victorian teas. They have a Christmas tea. They do just regular tours where they'll actually dress in the period, the 1900s period. They also have events kind of around the similar times that the city of Regina has events. So definitely check them out. I highly recommend any of their activities. It's a lot of fun. Now, if you liked this video, make sure that you subscribe and hit the little bell so that you get notified when my next video comes out. I've got a few more coming out. I'll probably space them every 2 weeks because I've got to get through all of the content. Or if you have had paranormal activity yourself, either in government house or in a different location, and you want me to try and see if I can get, a tour and see it for myself, let me know in the comments down below or send me a message. Or you can always jump over to my website with the link, and the link is on my channel, and you can connect with me. Until next time, my ghouls.